16. The Desert Bash. His rash, fierce blaze of riot cannot last, for violent fires soon burn out themselves. Light vanity, insatiate, cormorant. Shakespeare, King Richard II, 2.1, 33 to 38. During the last week of April 1972, Kermit Kim Roosevelt visited Tehran on behalf of one of his American business associates. Given his close personal relationship with the Shah, he was invariably granted a private meeting with the king. And in those days, as Iran's oil revenues increased and the number of supplicant heads of state and company executives visiting Tehran increased exponentially, getting a private audience with the Shah was no easy matter. As recorded in his daily journals, Asadollah Alam repeatedly urged the Shah to refrain from meeting with his head of state or the executive, saying that such meetings were no longer benefiting His Majesty's exalted international stature. Roosevelt was an exception. In the course of the meeting, the Shah talked solely about the international situation. He complained about King Faisal of Saudi Arabia and President Anwar al-Sadat of Egypt. Nasser was no longer on the Shah's list of worries, but Soviet gains in the region, particularly in places like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, were of constant concern. He ended his meeting with Roosevelt by declaring that, in spite of the difficulties involved, he felt he must play a more active role as a regional leader in organizing anti-communist forces. Domestic matters were not mentioned that day. By then, the Shah increasingly viewed himself as a regional and global leader, not just a head of state. His leadership in OPEC, Iran's emergence as the most powerful nation in the Persian Gulf, the prominent place he occupied in the Nixon administration's strategic vision for the Middle East, as well as the endless procession of Iranian and foreign sycophants, affirmed his growing sense of grandeur. When someone suggested that Iran launch a campaign to give the Shah the Nobel Peace Prize, the Shah wrote in the margin of the report, "If they beg us, we might accept. They give the Nobel to anybody these days. Kakasiya." Footnote. Kakasiya literally means any black face. There is a hint of racism in the everyday use of the term. End of footnote. Why would we belittle ourselves with this? Though the Shah was not interested in discussing domestic matters with Roosevelt, the old CIA hand met with a number of well-informed senior Iranians. And from them he heard that the country faced pressing domestic problems. The Shah's global preoccupations were causing him to pay these problems not enough attention. Roosevelt was told of a growing gap between the government and the people, of serious inflationary pressures on the economy, and most important of all, of the serious erosion of the credibility of the government. In the same period, both the American embassy in Tehran and the CIA began to notice hints of trouble. The embassy, for example, found that over the past several months, a number of more or less chronic causes of popular dissatisfaction had taken on consistently sharper edge. It even reported that Emir Abbas Hoveyda, by then in his 7th year as prime minister, might be replaced, if only as a sop to the public discontent, and suggested that it would be a good bet to assume that Jashid Amouzegar would be the successor. Corruption in high places, the disproportionate size of the military budget, and the mistreatment of the clergy, most specifically the arrest of a famous cleric, apparently falsifi, and the publication of his picture in highly compromising Congress with a young girl, were declared to be the direct causes of the discontent. Concurrently, in one of its intelligence estimates, the CIA first praised the Shah's work ethic and the improvements he had successfully brought in the people's livelihood. It noted that most people have been too busy doing well in other spheres to fuss about politics. Nevertheless, the report called the Shah an isolated figure, living in a formal court atmosphere with a regrettable lack of communication upward to him. It reported that not only would Iran official dare tell the Shah he is wrong about something, but even foreign ambassadors cringed before the Shah's responses to official presentations which displease him. The Queen, by then amongst the handful of people who still dared confront the Shah with unpleasant truths, captured this atmosphere, when much to the king's consternation, she disciplined the Shah's dog, adding, "Everyone is obsequious, even to your dog. I won't do it." The Shah's blithe disposition towards matters domestic and his obliviousness of the credibility gap between the government and the people is particularly remarkable in light of what had been happening to him and to his family in the few years before the 1972 meeting with Roosevelt. On the morning of April 10, 1965, he had decided to drive himself the short distance between the residential palace of his office in the Marble Palace. As he neared the steps of his office, a conscript named Reza Shamsabadi, who was on guard duty that day, shot at the Shah with his service machine gun. With remarkable agility and some luck, the Shah managed to climb the stairs and make it into his office, closing the door and taking cover behind his desk. Shamsabadi was able to enter the building before the other guards shot him dead. Bullet holes in the door to the Shah's office indicated how close the assailant had come. To avoid panic and maintain an air of normalcy, the Shah decided to keep his full day's schedule. In fact, in the early afternoon, he drove alone and without any escort or guard to the house of his son-in-law, Ardashir Zahidi. When the Shah was asked why he had ventured out only a few hours after a failed assassination attempt, he repeated an old Persian adage: "The same house won't be hit by thieves twice in the same night." That day, the court issued a brief statement about the failed assassination attempt. Behind the scenes, Savak and the Imperial Guard each tried to blame the other for what had clearly been a gross lapse of security. Someone should have identified the assailant long before he had the opportunity to assassinate the Shah. The assailant, in fact, had a record of both assaulting a prime minister, Ali Amini, and consorting with radical Islamic circles. Nevertheless, he had been picked to be part of the elite unit carrying loaded machine guns and entrusted with protecting the royal palaces. This period coincided with the rise of two men to the pinnacles of power, both of whom remained in their crucial post for almost 14 years. The first was Emir Abbas Hoveyda, appointed by the Shah to the post of prime minister when Islamist terrorists assassinated Ali Mansour in 1965. Hoveyda was a newcomer to the center stage of Iranian politics, and it was commonly assumed that his would be a caretaker appointment, and that he would be replaced with a more seasoned politician as soon as the crisis of the prime minister's assassination had passed. But Hoveyda proved everyone wrong. With a deft combination of efficiency, sycophancy, and hardball politics against his adversaries and his competitors, as well as a strong strategic alliance with Perviz Sabeti, the rising star of Savak, Hoveyda stayed in power for more than 13 years. His dismissal in 1977 was seen as a sea change of the opposition, while his arrest on November 7, 1978, was for many the beginning of the end for the Shah. The second person whose career experienced a meteoric rise in that decade was General Namatollah Nasseri, who had replaced the educated, soft-spoken General Hassan Pakravan as the head of Savak in 1965. In the weeks after the June 1963 uprising, the Shah had confided to an American official that he met to reprove Pakravan. Had he done his job, the Shah believed the June uprising could have been avoided. During his brief tenure, Pakravan had revamped Savak. Torture was forbidden, and a group of scholars acted as a de facto think tank. Pakravan himself started negotiating with some of the regime's most stalwart enemies. In 1964, he unsuccessfully tried to convince Khomeini to give up the dirty world of politics. He also met with the political dissident Bijan Jazani when the latter was in prison. Returning to his cell after one of these meetings, Jazani told one of his trusted comrades, "This guy is different and really wants to create a dialogue." Before this foray into reconciliation could bear any fruit, however, the Shah dismissed Pakravan and replaced him with Nasseri, whose only recommendation for the job was his absolute fealty to the Shah. Under his command, Savak became increasingly known for its brutality and use of torture and for its controversial influence on every facet of Iranian political life. In his answer to history, the Shah surprisingly claims that it was in fact the Prime Minister who was directly responsible for the day-to-day operation of Savak, and that, as head of state, he only intervened to exercise the right of pardon. The fact that the head of Savak was nominally a vice premier gave the Shah's claim its bureaucratic veneer. In reality, there is overwhelming evidence that from its inception, Savak was controlled directly by the Shah, and that the Prime Minister had little to do with the actual running of the agency. Moreover, in spite of overwhelming evidence of torture by Savak, far less than the opposition claimed in those years, but a reality nevertheless, the Shah always insisted that there was no torture or execution of political prisoners during his reign. As for those who were arrested for political reasons, I cannot include arsonists and saboteurs in this category. I affirm that they were properly treated and that they were never molested in any way. No one can tell me the name of a single politician who has been liquidated by Savak. While this caveat about arsonists and saboteurs seemed to imply that they were tortured, even the claim that no one was liquidated by Savak was not true. The famous case that belies the Shah's claim involved Jazani, the political prisoner with whom Pakravan had engaged in a dialogue. In the course of its ongoing and bloody war with Marxist urban guerrillas, Savak was surprised to learn that Jazani had been one of the founding leaders of the group. When the group assassinated a high-ranking member of Savak, Jazani, along with 8 other leading political dissidents, all serving time on earlier charges, were taken outside Tehran's Evin prison by a group of Savak interrogators and summarily executed. The official story was that the group had been shot while attempting to escape. This turned out to be the only case of known extrajudicial murder of its kind committing during the Shah's 37-year rule. There is no evidence that the Shah knew about or ordered the killing, but in thinking about Ghazani's tragic life trajectory, one can't help but wonder what might have happened to him and to Iran if Pakravan's attempt at reconciliation with opposition figures like Ghazani bore some fruit. If ever such a reconciliation might have been possible, it was in 1965 when the Shah was at the height of his power and when his personality was undergoing a steady metamorphosis. He was increasingly self-sufficient and making remarkable strides towards bringing Iran into the modern world. By then, a brilliant group of economists and technocrats from Mehdi, Sami, and Alinagi Alikani to Reza Moghadam and Kodadad Farmayan, oh my God, these names, and taken over the crucial ministries and banks in charge of the country's economic policy. They were, in the words of a report prepared for Senator Robert Kennedy, representatives of Iran's new men. They were fierce nationalists, but no longer enamored of Mossadegh and the National Front. Just to get a spelling of that last name. Okay, both of them actually. For fuck's sake. Okay, the first name. Khodadad. Khodadad. That's the first name. The second name. Farmayan. Did you get that? Farman Farmaian. Anyway. Again, they were, in the words of the report prepared for Senator Robert Kennedy, representatives of Iran's new men. They were fierce nationalists, but no longer enamored of Mossadegh and the National Front. Many of these new men had trained in universities in the West, and had left secure positions at top Western institutions to come back to Iran and change the society they loved. A kind of reverse brain drain had begun. This new technocratic elite began to map out for Iran an impressive plan of industrial development. The Kayami brothers of Iran National embodied the new spirit of entrepreneurship propagated by the Shah and the elite. What had begun as a small garage in the city of Mashhad was by 1978 the Iran National Industrial Conglomerate and was considered one of the most successful automotive industries in all of the Middle East. The company was by then employing more than 12,000 workers and producing 136,000 cars annually. In the beginning, about 80% of each car produced by Iran National was imported from England and simply assembled in Iran. By 1978, the figure of imported parts had been reduced to about 20%. More than 120 different companies were by then producing components for Iran National. Had the revolution not happened, one of the Kayami brothers said wistfully, Iran National would be where the South Korean car industry is today. In spite of the Shah's vigorous support for the private sector and entrepreneurship, he also had a statist tendency. This was rooted in his belief that he was actually a socialist, more socialist and revolutionary than anyone, he once said. Not only was the private university he helped to establish forcefully nationalized, But the first private television station, also created with his help, was bought by the government in less than a decade. While the Shah tolerated no independent labor unions, he supported labor laws that were surprisingly fair to the workers. Moreover, he forced all big industries to give half of their stock to their workers. Yet another gesture of socialism that was incongruent with his support for the private sector. In a sense, then, for the Shah, the decade between 1965 and 1975 was a pivotal period. In retrospect, a more tragic rise and fall, a more remarkable example of the economic accomplishments of a modernizing authoritarian monarch and the let's try that again. In retrospect, a more tragic rise and fall, a more remarkable example of the economic accomplishments of a modernizing authoritarian monarch and the inevitable result of the hubris of such absolute power is hard to imagine. Just as Iran was entering what the American sociologist Walt Rostow has called its takeoff period, a necessary time of concentrated change in preparing for a leap out of the vicious cycle of feudalism and poverty. And just as the Shah felt he was on top of the world, dark clouds appeared on the horizon. In his mind, the assassin's bullets he had dodged in 1965 were no more dangerous than what he had firmly believed in 1963 were the Kennedy administration's plans to turn Iran into a republic. Interlaced through the many reports from the American and British embassies praising the glories of the Shah's accomplishments were early warnings of a storm on the horizon. What in retrospect is remarkable is how many such warnings there were, and how not just the Shah, but the big powers and their intelligence ministries and bureaucracies failed to notice or take action. These warnings were invariably overshadowed by the Shah's increasingly euphoric and assertive confidence, and by the impressive improvements in Iran's economy. Even the American embassy was reluctant to send Washington reports that might be critical of the Shah. One diplomat posted in Tehran in the early 1970s says he was told that reports critical of the Shah were not welcome in the White House or the State Department. He had, for example, heard stories of the Shah's dalliance with a young woman that he might indeed be planning to marry her. The rumor, Alam makes clear in his daily journals, was true. On June 12, 1973, Alam told the Shah of a girl named Gilda was her name, who had been spreading strange rumors in the city claiming His Majesty had fallen madly in love with her. Alam ventured to add, "But of course, the king never falls in love with anyone." 2 weeks later, Alam again reported that there was a rumor that Your Majesty has taken a second wife. The Shah's response was no less incredible than Alam's flippant comments. "I have been with this bitch, Peter Sukte. I, too, have heard the rumors. They have even reached the ears of Shabanu. Call the woman to your office and tell her that she will be arrested if she continues with these shenanigans." The rumors continued. In those years, as Alam's journals make amply clear, the Shah's only recreation, his only respite from what he called the burdens of his office and the constant grumblings at home, was the company of increasingly larger numbers of women, guests in Alam's parlance, who were flown in, often from Europe, or an outing with the Shah. "If I don't have this recreation a couple of times a week," the Shah told Alam once, there is no way I could bear the burden of my office." Occasionally, local material was used. A special house was furnished by an Alam aide to facilitate these outings. So numerous were the men eager to act as royal procurers that the Shah eventually ordered them all to stop and entrusted only a handful of aides with the infamous job. The Queen, though obviously distraught at these infidelities, never felt threatened by them. But this time the rumors about G were different. Even the Queen's mother grew concerned and told the Lamb, "Fortunately, my daughter is not attached to this luxury," meaning she could easily ask for divorce. When Alam reported the conversation to the Shah, he flippantly dismissed the implied threat. Zeke, contextually Persian for bullshit, he reportedly said. But after some discussion with Alam, the two decided we should find a husband for the girl. G. Nevertheless, during the very same meeting, Alam gave the Shah a letter from a very nice girl, and reported that His Majesty was happy. As always, Alam's instinct was to blame Hoveyda for spreading rumors about the Shah's indiscretions. He told the Shah that Hoveyda wants to turn the Queen into an angel and create a negative image of His Majesty. The Shah's instinct, on the other hand, was to blame the KGB for the rumors. Neither man blamed the rumor on the Shah's crass infidelities. Moreover, the Shah's suspicion of KGB complicity and many pages in Alam's journals are stark reminders of the political and economic cost and consequences of these outings. The same pages show that on the rare occasions when the Shah questioned the wisdom of his own sexual indiscretions, Alam, in his most destructive moments of sycophancy, reassured the Shah, or his master, as he calls him, that the country was prosperous and no one begrudged the king a bit of fun. By 1975, these rumors spread to Western papers and American officials. Even Henry Kissinger had an opinion on the subject, telling Ardeshir Zahidi that a divorce would be detrimental to the image of the Shah in the United States. Eventually, the plan of action devised by the Shah and Alam was to put in place. G was married off, and the magazines in Tehran published images of the wedding. The Shah asked Alam to ensure that the Queen saw the article. But this was not the end of the story. After being parted from the Shah, G started a heated affair with General Mohammad Khattam, the commander of Iran's Air Force and the husband of the Shah's sister Fatemeh. By the time this affair began, Khattam had developed the reputation of being one of the most corrupt officers in the country. Even the Shah suspected him of financial malfeasance. What? Even the Shah suspected him of financial malfeasance. Whatever. Never even... Okay, anyway. On June 7th, that's one I'll have to look up. On June 7, 1975, for example, the New York Times wrote about close ties between Khattam and the swashbuckling Central Intelligence Agency operative Kermit Roosevelt. As a result of this friendship, the Times wrote U.S. manufacturer Northrop, Roosevelt's alleged client, had become a major contractor for Iran's Air Force. In yet another article, the Times claimed that Khattam and a partner had received a $28 million kickback for the $2.2 billion contract with Grumman. The U.S. Senate had hearings about these allegations, and the U.S. Embassy called Khattam the head of the Iranian air mafia, claiming that he and his accomplices received a percentage on every contract relating to air travel and the Air Force in Iran. At the same time, earlier reports by the same embassy had praised Khattam for his favorable disposition towards American military hardware and for his ability to curb some of the Shah's extreme decisions. A report prepared by the U.S. government even concluded that should something happen to the Shah, Khattam was the only officer who had the charisma, gravitas, and popularity to seize and maintain power. When, on September the 12th, 1975, Khatam died in a hang-gliding accident, rumors of foul play pointed to the Shah as a likely culprit. Some royalists insisted that Khatam was killed by Western powers in preparation for the 1979 revolution. All capable officers capable of saving the Shah had to be eliminated, they claim. Extensive investigations into the accident by experts from the Iranian army and by Bob Moyes, the American engineer who had built the kite, discovered no identification of foul play. The Shah had told Alam a month before the accident that the general was no longer of sound mind and that he had asked for his resignation as commander of the Air Force. He had been told that he would be sent as an ambassador to a capital of his choice. During the period leading up to his death, Khatam's friends also reported that he was depressed. In his journal, Alam is unusually coy about the events surrounding the death of the general and the Shah's comments about it. The Shah speculated that Khatam might have planned to kill himself and thus intentionally did not open his hang glider. Alam goes on to say that the Shah shared with him certain facts about Khatam so sensitive that he must take them to his grave. Khatam was not the only general who was a source of concern to the Shah in those years. In the 1960s, Timur Bakhtiar was also often on the Shah's mind. After the Shah had ordered him to leave Iran in 1962, Bakhtiar settled in Europe, a very hated but extremely rich man. There, the old anti-communist warrior suddenly changed color and became non-aligned. All his attempts to ingratiate himself with either the United States or Britain had failed. He was now desperate to find allies amongst the countries of the Third World, and even in the ranks of the Iranian opposition, and he began to repackage himself as a revolutionary. The Shah, on the other hand, ordered Savak to closely monitor Bakhtiar's every move. A maid in one hotel and eavesdropping equipment in another allowed Savak to know much of what the general did. But the Shah's relationship with Bakhtiar changed after his tumultuous 1967 state visit to Germany. The Shah was informed that he needed extra security this time. German police had arrested some men, a team of terrorists who had been hired by Bakhtiar to assassinate the Shah. In the course of the Shah's visit to West Berlin, an Iranian student failed in his effort to have a car filled with bombs and, directed by remote control, hit and destroy the Shah's limousine. At the same time, in Berlin, the Shah faced one of the largest demonstrations ever organized against him. One student was killed in clashes with the police. The whole trip was a public relations fiasco for the Shah, and he was informed that Bakhtiar had been at least partially responsible for the massive demonstrations and the failed assassination attempts. Even before returning to Tehran, the Shah ordered the Majlis to pass a law confiscating all of Bakhtiar's properties in Iran. A court tried him in absentia and condemned him to death. Moreover, the Shah was led to believe that Bakhtiar still had a network of allies within Savak, so a purge of his purported supporters took place. The Shah's Bakhtiar problem became even more serious when the Ba'ath Party seized power in Iraq in 1968. In the new party, Bakhtiar finally found his most reliable ally. He was invited to settle in Baghdad and eventually given an Iraqi diplomatic passport, allowing him to travel freely around the world. Moreover, the Ba'ath Party pressured different members of the Iranian opposition to meet with Bakhtiar Leaders of the Tudeh party, activists from the ranks of the Confederation of Iranian Students, and a large number of Iranians domiciled in Iraq met with Bakhtiar and listened to his proposal for a united front against the Shah. The Iraqi government made it clear to these Iranians that unless they cooperated with Bakhtiar, they would be expelled and their properties confiscated. Some sources have even claimed that Ayatollah Khomeini was amongst those who not only met with but agreed to cooperate with Bakhtiar. The most controversial contact between Bakhtiar and the Tudeh party, a man named Abbas Shahriyari, eventually nicknamed a man of a thousand faces, who was the head of the reactivated Tudeh party cells in Tehran, had initiated the contacts between the general and the party. About the time that the first secretary of the Tudeh, Reza Radmanesh, was scheduled to meet with Bakhtiar, the KGB informed the Tudeh Party Central Committee that Shahriyari was in fact an agent of Savak. But Radmanesh refused to believe the change, and the meeting took place. Thanks to Shahriyari, Bakhtiar's contacts in Iran were all put under surveillance. In April 1968, on the way to Baghdad from his home in Switzerland, Bakhtiar stopped in Beirut, where he was arrested and convicted on a charge of illegal arms smuggling. The Iranian government used all its power and connections in Lebanon to have Bakhtiar extradited to Iran, where a court had already passed a death sentence against him. But the Iraqi government was pressuring Lebanon to allow Bakhtiar to continue on to Baghdad. Eventually, after 9 months, Iraq won Bakhtiar's release and arranged for his travel to Baghdad. It is reported that an estimated $1 million in bribes was given to the Lebanese president to ensure that he did not sign Bakhtiar's extradition papers for Iran. In Baghdad, Bakhtiar redoubled his campaign against the Shah, and unbeknownst to him and his Ba'athist patrons, the circle of his aides and supporters was filled with Savak agents. According to one estimate, 16 of Bakhtiar's closest aides, including his cook and his typist, were agents of Savak. Their order was to kill Bakhtiar, for the Shah was becoming increasingly impatient with the general's continued activities. Aware that the Shah was tightening the noose around him, in early 1970, Bakhtiar tried to convince the Ba'ath Party to help him kill the Shah. Saddam Hussein, by then already the party's second-in-command, rejected Bakhtiar's request. Finally, on August 7, 1970, Bakhtiar was shot by one of the double agents who had wormed his way into the general's inner circle. 5 days later, Bakhtiar died. The Shah, according to Alam, rejoiced at the news. The successful assassination had come on the heels of some bad news from Iraq, where Savak had been behind a failed coup attempt. The man Savak had entrusted with the job of leading the coup had informed Ba'ath Party officials of the Iranian overture and had been instructed by Iraqi officials to become a double agent. The Iraqi security forces waited till the last minute and then arrested everyone involved with the coup attempt. All 41 of those arrested were executed. During this period, the Shah demanded and often received concessions from both the British and American governments. One of his earliest demands was for both countries to end their contacts with opposition forces inside Iran. 6 years earlier, he had made the same demand only to have both countries roundly reject the request. This time, however, the Shah was in a different, more powerful position. The United States not only ceased its contacts with opposition figures, but began to reduce the number of intelligence officers assigned to work in Iran. By the mid-1970s, their total number in Iran had reached pre-World War II levels. Even embassy contacts with Ali Amini, by then an ex-prime minister with no political role and a judicial case pending against his wife, had become problematic for the Shah. He threw the equivalent of a diplomatic tantrum when, in 1968, Armin Mayer, the American ambassador in Iran, invited Ali Amini to dinner. Though the embassy calls the Shah's reaction Byzantine, something that only a Persian mind can fathom, it did decide to henceforth contact Amini only through an intermediary. Worried that its relationship with the Shah might be endangered, Great Britain also chose not to deploy any of its own intelligence service in Iran, feeling they had little option other than to rely on SAVAK. With virtually no contacts with the opposition, both Britain and America relied on the reports they received from the Shah and from SAVAK, or on claims made by the opposition outside the country. If the Shah was overly optimistic and blind to his regime's weakness, the opposition demonized the Shah and could not even entertain the possibility that he was making any positive changes in Iran. They even found a way to dismiss the Shah's role in OPEC, as yet another proof of his role as a lackey of U.S. imperialism. Higher oil prices, advocates of this theory proposed, were more of a burden on Europe and Japan, and thus the Shah's insistence on higher prices was simply benefiting the United States. A good example of how the Shah and the opposition approached political questions can be found in the issue of political prisoners. The opposition outlandishly claimed that Iran had hundreds of thousands of political prisoners, whereas the actual number was closer to 4,000. No less exaggerated was their claim that thousands had been killed and tortured to death by SAVAK. The actual number of people executed for political crimes during the Shah's 37-year reign was about 1,500. Still a high number, but less than the figure offered by the opposition. On the other hand, for years, when the Western media asked the Shah about the plight of political prisoners and torture in Iran, the Shah invariably dismissed the question by saying Iran has no political prisoners, only criminals. In Alam's daily journals, there are numerous references to episodes, some involving shouts and tears, in which the Queen tried to convince the Shah that more must be done to reach a compromise with the opposition, particularly those in the intellectual class. The government agencies run by their friends or family, particularly Iranian National Radio and Television, managed by their cousin Reza Qutbi, and the Organization for the Intellectual Development of Children, managed by their childhood friend Lily Amir Arjumand, were often the only place opposition intellectuals could find employment. Pressure on Qutbi to purge his staff increased substantially when SAVAK discovered and stopped a plot by a new television employees and camera crew to abduct the Queen and the Crown Prince. Even before this plot, Alam had been ordered more than once by the Shah to work with SAVAK and investigate the allegations that Iranian National Radio and Television was infiltrated and dominated by communists. More than once in this period, the Queen asked the Shah to control the excesses of the police and SAVAK. For example, when the police raided a nightclub known as a hangout of Tehran's jet set, what the British Embassy called the Jeunesse Dorée of Tehran, the Queen complained about police behavior. Not only had they shut down the nightclub, but they had physically abused the customers and forcefully shaved a number of influential scions of hippie appearance. That same day, Hussein Zenderoudi, an acclaimed painter and favorite of the Queen, was seized by the police while traveling in a car and had his artistic locks chopped off in an insulting manner. When the details of the story recounted by the Queen were confirmed, the Shah immediately ordered the dismissal of the chief of police. The gesture, according to Alam, had a positive impact on the people. The moral of the story, according to the British Embassy, was that the permissive society with court backing seems to have won this round against the police. The incident also was an example of the Queen's increasing interference in political matters on the side of liberalization. These events were all taking place during the Shah's dramatic decade of rising power and independence between 1965 and 1975. One of the first signs of this new independence was his decision to sign a major economic and military deal with the Soviet Union. In return for the purchase of Iran's gas in 1965, the Soviets agreed to build a steel mill for Iran, something that had come to represent for both the Shah and his father a dramatic symbol in Iran's movement into the modern world. No sooner had Britain and the United States learned the details of the deal than they tried to pressure the Shah to change his mind. The United States was particularly worried that such an agreement would be a first step in the Shah's eastward tilt. The American ambassador pleaded with the Shah to reconsider, pointing out that the Americans are human and there is not slightest doubt they would be deeply hurt that valued and admired friend like Shah has decided to trade in arms with our adversaries. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to read that again. That didn't read well. Let's see. The American ambassador pleaded with the Shah to reconsider, pointing out that the Americans are human and there is not slightest doubt they would be deeply hurt that valued and admired friend like Shah has decided to trade in arms with our adversaries. No, it's how it's written. Particularly at the time when whole American nation is gripped by anxiety over Vietnam. Now, I read that properly. That's yeah. But the Shah refused to change his mind. In November 1965, the Shah had informed U.S. Ambassador Armin Mayer that he was uneasy about what he called the growing estrangement between the U.S. and Iran. In addition to his grievance against John Kennedy for having forced Amini on him, the Shah described how, under pressure from the United States and its promise of aid, he had walked away from the 1959 agreement with the Soviet Union. Yet in the 6 years since, the United States had failed to live up to its promises. When on March 16, 1966, Mayer raised some of Washington's concern about the new Russian deal, the Shah, in a dark mood, recalled how Eisenhower had rejected his pleas for help in constructing a steel mill. If the agreement with the Soviet Union was the most telling sign of the Shah's newfound independence, the two big events he organized in that period, his coronation in 1967 and the celebration of 2,500 years of monarchy in 1971, signaled his emergence as a more self-assured figure of domestic dominance and international significance. The decline of the British Empire, the falling star of Nasser of Egypt, the U.S. entanglement in Vietnam, China's growing tensions with Russia, and finally the rise in the price of oil all combined to encourage the Shah to become increasingly assertive. A belated decision to have his coronation was one sign of this new confidence. For a variety of reasons, his coronation had been delayed. In the 40s, he was fighting to remain relevant and royal. In the 50s, early plans called for him to have a coronation concurrent with a party to celebrate 2,500 years of monarchy. The coronation was an elegantly simple event, modeled after Reza Shah's. The big difference was that this time the Queen was also being crowned as the regent. Indeed, on September 11th, 1967, the Leadership Committee of the Constituent Assembly convened especially for the purpose of revising the Constitution, informed the Shah and the Queen that the requisite amendments to articles of the Constitution had passed the Assembly. One new article stipulated that the Crown Prince must be 20 before he could ascend the throne. Another article made the Queen Regent in the event that the Shah died before the Crown Prince was of age. It was decided that the coronation would take place on the Shah's 48th birthday, October 26, 1967. The Crown Prince was to have a key role in the ceremonies, and perhaps not coincidentally, he was exactly the same age as the Shah, at the time as the Shah had been when his father crowned himself king and expected the young Crown Prince to play his role. The Shah had decided to make the coronation a major but essentially domestic affair after informal soundings in London, Copenhagen, and elsewhere showed that Her Majesty the Queen and other sovereigns would be able to attend with such relatively short notice. Moreover, he had insisted on avoiding any waste of extravagance. It has been estimated that the total cost of the event was £1,250,000. I think that's what it is. I don't know. The most complicated elements of the event itself were the design of a new crown for the Queen and the construction of 2 royal horse-drawn carriages, which would carry the royal couple and the Crown Prince from their residential palaces to Gulistan Palace, where the ceremonies were to be held. Finding someone capable of constructing the carriages was no easy task. The world's most reputable builder of such carriages lived in Vienna and had to be coaxed out of retirement to build 2 carriages that would be at once traditional and royal and also comply with modern security requirements. Horses for the carriage were bought in Hungary. Making the Queen's crown was less difficult. Under strict security, the crown jewels were given to one of the most famous jewelers in the world, Van Cleef and Arpels, who were asked to weave the invaluable gems into a design that was traditionally Persian as well as modern. While the Shah crowned himself, the Queen knelt before the Shah and received her crown from his hands. The event itself lasted more than 35 minutes and went smoothly. All past prime ministers, with the exception of Ali Amini, had been invited. On October 28, the heads of diplomatic missions in Tehran met with the Shah to offer the gifts they had chosen to commemorate the coronation. They had earlier agreed to find something personal from the head of the state for the Shah's personal use. While the British gave him a silver gilt fruit basket, the Italians offered a lapis lazuli and a gold trinket box. The Russians offered a huge china umbrella stand, and the U.S. gave a Tiffany-made silver gilt bowl. The oddest gifts were the King of Naples' mounted rhinoceros horn and Japan's fresh apples. The Argentinian gift was lost in transit in Heathrow. More flamboyant, expensive, and controversial than the coronation was the 1971 celebration of 2,500 years of monarchy in Iran. The idea, first conceptualized in 1959, had initially been rather limited in scope. A small number of the country's elder statesmen, as well as the top officers of the government, were appointed by the Shah to the committee to celebrate 2,500 years of monarchy. Their task, in the Shah's words, was to celebrate our culture's proud heritage and show the world that Iran's continued existence and its national sovereignty is possible through the continuation of monarchy. In the beginning, it was assumed that the Shah's coronation would take place during the same celebration, but by 1966 the Shah had changed his mind. A decade after the formation of the committee, virtually nothing had been done to plan the celebration. The Shah lost patience and, with little forethought or consultation, ordered the celebration to take place in 1971. Suddenly, planners were faced with the reality that in some 18 months, hundreds of dignitaries, many of them heads of state and hundreds more journalists, were going to converge on Persepolis, the ancient capital of the Persian Empire. Nothing could be a more majestic reminder of Iran's past imperial grandeur than the ruins of Persepolis. Yet, the nearest city, Shiraz, had no airport capable of handling the requisite large planes. There was only one luxury hotel, with no more than a couple dozen rooms, and even they did not measure up to the grand celebration the Shah had envisioned. According to the CIA, tens of millions of dollars were spent on an airfield suitable for 707s. New roads to and from the airport to Persepolis had to be expeditiously built. Contractors demanded and received extra money to work virtually around the clock to finish the projects on time. Then there was the question of security. Most of the heads of state would arrive in Shiraz late at night, and the road to their accommodations in the desert would be dark, and therefore dangerous. Specialists from the oil company were brought in to line the road with temporary gaslight fixtures. The idea of building luxury hotels to house the hundreds of dignitaries was easily dismissed as impossible. Thus emerged the controversial notion of building a city of tents near Persepolis. The most expensive tent maker in the world, Janssen AG of Switzerland, was asked to design not only small tents to house the guests, but a gigantic tent to house the gala dinner. The tents had to be fireproof and air-conditioned. They were designed to withstand winds of up to 100 kilometers per hour. 250 Mercedes-Benz bulletproof limousines were bought to ferry about the heads of state, while Limoges was ordered to design special serving plates. Haviland supplied china cups for coffee. Fancy linen and towels were ordered from Portholt, and several thousand glasses were ordered from Baccarat. It had been the Queen's order that the guests must all feel they are staying in a palace. A French designer was commissioned to make 2 sets of 30 dresses for the ladies-in-waiting, one for lunch and one for dinner. Elizabeth Arden was hired to set up a beauty salon with 40 stylists ready to service the ladies at a moment's notice. After the site for the tent city had been picked, a new problem reared its head. The organizing committee found that the patch of wilderness they had designated was a notorious den of venomous snakes. According to one member of the committee, the area was treated with a special spray developed for the occasion, and then a 5-ton truck was used to carry away the snakes, lizards, tarantulas, and other dangerous denizens of the desert. The extravagant expenditure of millions of dollars turned what began as an attempt to assert Iran's imperial past, educate the world and Iranians themselves about Iranian history, and herald the arrival of a new and greater Iran into the embarrassment of the Shah and the bonanza for his opposition. The 2,500 schools and clinics that were to be built, the 2,500 books that were commissioned on every conceivable facet of Iranian society and history, and the launch of Acta Iranica, a truly remarkable encyclopedia of Iran, were outshadowed by the rumor and reality of corruption, and the embarrassment of nouveau riche extravaganza. It has been a common adage of Iranian history that the soul of the nation was riven between the Zoroastrian first millennium and the Islamic second millennium. One second here. There is a footnote here. After the sentence concerning the tents, they were designed to withstand winds of up to 100 kilometers per hour. Footnote. It has been suggested that the idea for the tent city's design came from a sumptuous 1520 summit between England's Henry VIII and Francis I that was called the Field of the Cloth of Gold because of the extravagance of the costumes and the tents. End of footnote. A key goal of the 2500 celebration, in the words of one of its originators, Shojaddin Shafa, was to accentuate the pre-Islamic imperial grandeur of Persia. Pre-Islamic imperial grandeur of Persia. Pre-Islamic imperial grandeur of Persia, just in case anyone didn't get that, to the detriment of its Islamic component. It was hoped that the celebration would mark the notion of the third millennium of imperial Persian grandeur, based on the Pahlavis dynasty, modern and secular narrative of identity. But ultimately, the celebration ended up having the opposite effect. It played right into the hands of the opposition. Indeed, less than a decade later, when the new clerical regime came to power, it set out to banish from Iranian history any allusion to the imperial Zoroastrian past, and instead accentuate the role of Islam in shaping Iranian identity. Both the Shah and the opposition waged an elaborate public relations war about the ceremony. Ayatollah Khomeini issued a statement asking heads of state to boycott what he called the Devil's Festival. The Confederation of Iranian Students tried to mobilize the Iranian diaspora and Western public opinion to pressure Western countries not to attend. The Iranian regime used hard-knuckle politics to convince heads of state to take part. The British and French governments were warned that the future of the important copper deposits at Kerman, in which British and French firms were struggling for the contract, was inexorably linked to Queen Elizabeth's and President Pompidou's presence at the celebration. The Dutch ambassador was told to produce Queen Juliana or else, while the German government, ever eager to hold its position in the Iranian economy, was told that it must ensure the attendance of the German president. Ironically, the only country that was more than eager to send its head of state to the celebration was not welcome. Israel made it clear that it would be happy to participate at the highest level, but the Shah demurred. Not only would an Israeli presence have caused virtually every Muslim head of state to stay away, but ever since Ardashir Zahidi's appointment as foreign minister, Iran had been trying to balance its regional policy by improving its ties with Arab states, so Israel was not invited. But in spite of the pressures exerted by the Shah's regime, some of the most important heads of state failed to show up. For the Shah, one of the biggest blows was the news that Queen Elizabeth would not attend. According to the British ambassador, the Shah was rather grumpy when he heard the news. He then demanded that instead of the Queen, he would take the Prince of Wales to come. He would like the Prince of Wales to come. Even that, he was told, was impossible. This time the excuse was that he was doing his service in the Royal Navy. Reluctantly, he settled for Prince Philip and Princess Anne. They offered to help with the nightmarish questions of protocol that would arise. So many heads of state, each with different seniority and standing in the diplomatic rules of etiquette. The Shah was appreciative of this help, and of Prince Philip's and Princess Anne's participation. He gave the princess royal a stallion as a token of his appreciation for her presence. Even President Nixon chose not to attend, sending in his place Vice President Spiro Agnew. The Russians sent President Podgorny, while Tito of Yugoslavia, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and Prince Rainier III of Monaco, and his wife, Princess Grace, were the other important invitees who agreed to come. In spite of the heavy French accent of the festivities, from food and wine to tents and towels, French President Georges Pompidou refused to attend. If I did go, he said in biting sarcasm, they would probably make me head waiter. The Shah was told that the reason for Pompidou's decision to skip the celebration was his unhappiness with the seating arrangements. Who the hell does he think he is? The Shah reportedly asked. The British Embassy described the event itself as a sumptuous celebration of daring enterprise, a good idea, but marred by the element of excess. It shared the fate of so many other projects in Iran, derailed by a touch of megalomania from which the Shah, according to the embassy, now suffered. The municipality of Tehran alone, according to the British Embassy, had spent $81 million on the celebrations. A member of the organizing committee has challenged these estimates, claiming that only $22 million was spent. Documents published by the Islamic Republic, based on the Asian regime's archives, provide even lesser numbers than those suggested by the British Embassy. Waiters and sommeliers were imported from Europe, some of them from the hotel in St. Moritz, where the Shah and his family owned a chalet. They served only the Bakchik best, magnums of Chateau Lafite, 1945, bottles of Blanc de Blancs, Moet Chandon, 1911, and Dom Perignon Rosé, 1959. 25,000 bottles were shipped from Paris for the 600 guests. The servers were reportedly paid $2,500 for their week-long trip. Dinner was a 6-course, 5-hour extravaganza, created by the famed Max Bluet. Much of it was flown in from Maxims of Paris. It included 50 roast peacocks, quail's eggs stuffed with golden caviar, crayfish mousse, saddles of lamb. The only thing Persian on the menu was the caviar. The Shah, allergic to caviar, was served a vegetable instead. In 1980, the Guinness Book of Records chose the ceremony as the most extravagant party on record. Iran's radical groups, particularly the new urban guerrilla organizations, which had emerged only a few years earlier, had vowed to disrupt the celebration and negate the claim that the Shah's regime was an island of stability. Amongst the efforts to disrupt the event was the failed attempt to kidnap Shahram, the Shah's nephew, and the successful, though inconsequential, destruction of an electric power line near Tehran. The regime's success in containing damage was made possible by the arrest of a large number of dissidents and careful watch on another 1,500 individuals deemed potentially disruptive. As Ardashir Zahidi wrote in a letter to the Shah, rumor had it that prisons were so overfilled that Savak had rented special houses and used them as temporary prisons. Zahidi also criticized the fact that only French food was served. If we have 2,500 years of glorious civilization, he asked rhetorically, why then can we not serve them Persian dishes like kebab, kubadeh, or even ab gusht? Some of the cost for the celebration were paid for by contributions from businessmen. how many of these contributions were made voluntarily, and how many were made under direct or implicit duress is not clear. The Armenians of Iran, for example, were told to cough up $1 million. The controversial celebration was taking place just as the Shah was finally realizing his dream of becoming the dominant force in the Persian Gulf. In 1965, he had learned that Britain intended to leave its bases in the Gulf, and he had indicated his determination to have Iran replace Britain as the dominant military power in the region. The British were keen on disabusing D-I-S-A-B-U-S-I-N-G. The British were keen on disabusing the Shah of any such notion. Dennis Wright recommended that in meetings with the Shah that year the British government should not pull our punches in explaining that it is illusory to think that there is any chance of Iran inheriting our role. More than once, British officials made it clear that the reason for their opposition to the Shah's plans was their close ties with the Arab sheiks ruling in the lateral states of the Persian Gulf. The British resistance to the Shah's plans created a period of considerable tension in the relations between the two countries. At one time, Zahedi, in a moment of anger, threatened a military confrontation with the British. On another occasion, he declared the British ambassador persona non grata. The air was cleared. Only after the Shah got involved. In fact, according to Dennis Wright, the decision not to have Queen Elizabeth attend the 2,500-year celebration was more than anything because of the difficulties we were having with the Iranians over our withdrawal from the Persian Gulf. The Shah was unhappy with the British too. In May 1968, the British Embassy reported hearing from too many unimpeachable sources that the Shah and most of his advisors, not just the wild men such as Ardashir Zahedi, are fed up with the British. For the Shah, one problem on his way to becoming the hegemonic force in the region was Iran's lingering claim of sovereignty over Bahrain. He had come to believe that those claims were impossible to actualize, but he was unwilling to give up Iran's claim with no gains. No less strategically indispensable from Iran's regional hegemony were the three islands of Big Toom, Small Toom, and Abu Musa, small but located at the heart of the Strait of Hormuz, where the Persian Gulf meets the Indian Ocean. Dominate the islands, the Shah knew, and you dominate the most important waterway in the world. In order to establish the legal foundation of Iran's claims to the three islands, the Shah ordered the foreign ministry to dispatch a seasoned diplomat with some experience in archival research to be posted to London, where his responsibility would be to trace public record office records for any documents asserting Iran's legitimate claim to the islands. The Shah also appointed a seasoned diplomat as his personal emissary to negotiate with Dennis Wright about the fate of both Bahrain and the three islands. The British were relieved that the Shah had not left these sensitive negotiations in the hands of Foreign Minister Ardashir Zahedi, who was known for what the British viewed as his extreme nationalism, his anti-British sentiments, and his insistence on Iran's claim of sovereignty over Bahrain. Eventually, the Shah agreed to a face-saving solution. Iran agreed to have the UN hold a referendum in Bahrain and promised to abide by the wishes of citizens, should they opt for independence. For the Shah, the more crucial part of this agreement was the de facto recognition of Iran's rights to the three strategic islands. During this period, the Shah was also constantly reminding the Americans of his desire to become the dominant force in the region. When Richard Nixon visited Tehran in 1967 in preparation for his new presidential campaign, he had an unusually long meeting with the Shah. Nixon recounted the key elements of the discussion to the American ambassador, Armin Meyer. The Shah, he said, had interesting ideas about the future security of the region. The defense of the Persian Gulf must be left to Iran, thus sparing the United States the need to spread its forces across every corner of the world. A year later, after the Shah met with Dean Rusk while visiting the United States, the Secretary of State's net impression was that the Shah was rather hoping that the U.S. will pick Iran as its chosen instrument in the Middle East. When Nixon became president, the Shah's dream became a reality. Iran was picked in the grand scheme of the Nixon Doctrine to be the dominant force, the policeman of the Persian Gulf. In Henry Kissinger's words, the Shah was willing to fill the vacuum left in the region by British withdrawal, now menaced by Soviet intrusion and radical momentum. In the midst of the Vietnam War, Kissinger wrote, there was no way the United States could take on this added role. As the Shah set out on an ambitious military expansion, he also decided to take out another piece of insurance against domestic or international guerrilla activities. Though Yasser Arafat and his PLO were the most crucial source of training for Iranian guerrillas in those days, Though Yasser Arafat and the PLO were the most crucial source of training for Iranian guerrillas in those days, Though Yasser Arafat and the PLO were the most crucial source of training for Iranian guerrillas in those days, just to make sure you got that, and though the Palestinian leadership went out of its way in public pronouncements to attack the Shah and his regime, particularly for their close ties to Israel, the Shah paid Arafat $500,000 by way of support on September 14, 1969. It was understood that both sides would try to keep this unusual transaction away from the eyes of American and Israeli officials. In his letter confirming the receipt of the check and thanking the Shah for his generous assistance, Arafat called the Shah his Akhi brother or comrade. Becoming the dominant force in the Persian Gulf had several immediate consequences. The Shah's decision in 1974 to send Iranian forces to Dhofar, in the strategically important kingdom of Oman, to fight communist insurgents was one direct result of this new role. Instead of American or British forces fighting the Chinese, the Soviet-supported fighters. It was the Iranian Special Forces and Air Force that successfully pushed back the Dhofari guerrillas. There were some 2,500 Iranian troops operating as an independent brigade, but formally taking their orders from the British commander of the Sultan's armed forces. As the Shah informed an American military delegation, the Dhofaris were by themselves not a serious problem. However, they were being furnished with sophisticated equipment by the Soviets. There were over 100 Cubans and several East Germans supporting the rebels. According to the British, the South Yemen government, a Soviet satellite was also offering the guerrillas help at that time. In this period, the Shah grew particularly concerned about Soviet influence in Iran's neighboring countries. Not only was Russia gaining more of a foothold in Iraq with the rise of the Ba'ath Party, but the Shah's fear of Soviet expansion was only redoubled when the Prime Minister of Afghanistan, Daoud Khan, organized a coup and declared the country a republic. The Shah immediately wrote to the British government indicating his belief that the Soviets were behind the coup. While visiting Washington, D.C. on July 24, 1973, a week after the coup in Afghanistan, the Shah told Kissinger of his plans to have the deposed king flown secretly to some point in Afghanistan, and he would appeal for help. Savak apparently had fresh intelligence on the issue of Russian complicity in the coup. The British Foreign Secretary wrote back to the Shah, saying that while Britain shared his concern and believed that Russia almost certainly had foreknowledge of the coup, the British did not believe the Russians had instigated it. More crucially, the Afghan king, Zahir Shah, rejected the offer of help, preferring a life of exile in Rome, partially underwritten by the stipend the Shah arranged for him. But the Soviet role in Afghanistan was not the only source of disagreement between the Shah and his Western allies. The price of oil was easily one of the most constant sources of tension, even acrimony. As the Shah pushed for higher oil prices, the global economy faced not only a serious energy crisis, but a recession. Late in 1967, Ambassador Mayer had reported a most unpleasant visit with the Shah when the latter used terms such as robbery, thieves, and some unprintable epithets. Shah professed to be completely disgusted with consortium's behavior. At one point, the Shah even declared that if the companies wanted war, they could have it, adding that this time the war would not be with the Mossadegh, but with the united Iran behind the Shah himself. In January 1971, Nixon wrote to the Shah asking for help in finding a solution to the growing conflict between OPEC and consumer nations. Oil supply, Nixon wrote, is vital to the free world. Therefore, your interest in oil and ours are bound intimately together. The consuming countries need a secure source of oil available on reasonable terms. The Shah's response was categorical. Without mentioning Mossadegh by name, he referred to the fact that Iran already owns our resources according to the Oil Nationalization Act of 1951. He added that Iran was different from other countries in the region in that it was the only one in a position to become a developed country. Finally, he blamed the oil companies for the current state of negotiations between the oil-producing nations and Western companies. A similar message was sent to British Prime Minister Edward Heath. The Nixon administration discussed how to respond to the Shah's intransience. The idea of trying to remove him from power was bounced around. Kissinger and Nixon ultimately won by arguing that removing the Shah might well lead to the coming to power of a regime that would be even more troublesome for the United States. On Vietnam, too, the Shah supported Nixon, but increasingly on his own terms. For years, the Shah had been one of the staunchest defenders of the U.S. positions in Vietnam. In October 1967, he had even offered to try to act as a mediator and find a solution, and had tried to use Feridun Hoveyda as his special envoy on Vietnam. Hoveyda was at the time the head of a division in Iran's foreign ministry that dealt with international organizations. He had lived in France for many years and had developed close relationships with some of the West's most acclaimed intellectuals. Goddard, Truffaut, Warhol, who did a portrait of him, and Pasolini were amongst his friends. His surprising appointment to the post of Iran's ambassador to the United Nations was in part the result of the Shah's troubled infatuation with intellectuals. He despised their disposition, yet desired their approval. In private, he invariably referred to them as an intellectual, and being a Persian vernacular term for excrement. That someone like Hoveyda would accept the UN post also indicated that moderate members of the Iranian technocratic class had by then decided that only by allying themselves with the Shah, even accepting his authoritarian leadership, could they hope to push Iran towards modernization and eventually democracy. Nevertheless, there was still a measure of mutual distrust between the Shah and members of the intelligentsia who had joined his regime. Thus, it was with some trepidation that Feridun Hoveyda rushed back to Tehran in October 1967 after he was pulled out of a meeting at the UN and given a note that read, "Top secret," to Feridun. Board immediately. Iran Air's direct flight to Tehran. Necessary orders have been issued to the captain and to Mehrabad Airport. Signed MRP, the Shah's initials. His worries began to gnaw at him when a police car was waiting for him on the tarmac at the Tehran airport, and he was told that they were not at liberty to tell him where they were taking him. By 10 o'clock, they arrived in Niavaran Palace, where there was a party, and he was taken to the library. Almost immediately, the Shah appeared and told Hoveyda in a voice that was solemn, "What I am about to tell you is an absolute secret between me and the President of the United States. It should remain so because the slightest leak might provoke an international crisis." His top secret mission, according to Hoveyda, was to go to France and, through contacts amongst his leftist friends, get in touch with representatives of the North Vietnamese government. President Johnson, the Shah said, was tired of the war and wanted an honorable peace, but circumstances did not allow him to make a peace gesture. He had thus asked the Shah to act on behalf of the United States and attempt a deal. It took Hoveyda only 4 days to receive his negative answer from the North Vietnamese government. Documents from the American archives offer a slightly different version of these events. It was, in fact, the Shah who first offered his help in finding a new initiative regarding Vietnam. President Johnson was advised to tell the Shah that the United States deeply appreciated his interest and concern, but added that they would offer no explicit approval of his efforts, as it would be a kiss of death. About the same time, the Shah also offered to act as a mediator in the Arab-Israeli conflict. But the United States politely demurred and asked the Shah to postpone, for the time being, the idea of sending a special emissary to launch such a peace initiative. A few years later, however, the United States did need the Shah's help in earnest. On October 21, 1972, a special Nixon envoy met with the Shah just as he had returned from the Soviet Union. Nixon wanted the Shah to immediately agree to send to South Vietnam Iran's entire fleet of 90 F-5 airplanes. Such a transfer, the Shah was told, was essential if honorable peace was to be achieved in Vietnam. The United States, of course, offered to expeditiously and appropriately compensate Iran for the planes. Much to the envoy's surprise, the Shah offered full support for the U.S. effort in Vietnam, but agreed to send only a total of 32 aircraft, arguing that sending any more would jeopardize Iran's national interest. The Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation were not happy news for the Shah. As soon as the story broke, the Shah asked Zahedi to keep close watch and report on any major developments. In the beginning, the Shah and Zahedi both believed the Nixon line that it was much ado about nothing. It was Senator Barry Goldwater, a close friend of Zahedi's and a big supporter of the Shah, who delivered the sobering news that a majority of the Senate was now in favor of Nixon's impeachment. The Shah kept up his ties with Nixon even after his fall. He continued to send him gifts of caviar, and more than once he arranged for Nixon to find employment representing American companies wishing to do business with Iran. Interesting. During the Ford and Carter administrations, in addition to the problem of oil, two new issues became irritants to the Shah's relationship with the United States. The first was the perennial problem of the Shah's desire to buy more military hardware, including some of the most sophisticated planes and radar. The second issue was Iran's nuclear program. The issues of military purchases was complicated by the Shah's desire to buy AWACs, new planes equipped with the most sophisticated radar, and F-14 and F-16 planes equipped with Phoenix air-to-air computer-guided missiles. It is estimated that close to a third of total U.S. arms sales went to Iran during the decades between 1965 and 1975. America's resistance on some of these sales angered the Shah. President Ford was particularly worried about tensions in the Iranian-American relationship. At a private dinner on October 21, 1975, he asked Ardashir Zahedi, "Please tell me candidly, what is wrong? Is there any trouble or misunderstanding between us?" Zahedi complained about the American inability to understand the Shah and his motives. Attacks in the media, he said, were a good example of this failure to communicate. So frustrated was the Shah with these attacks that in September 1977, while in a very somber mood, he told William Sullivan, Carter's choice as the American ambassador in Iran, that he thought he had arrived at a turning point in his future relations with the U.S. The issues at stake, he said, were far greater than AWACs. Far greater than, is that AWACS? There we go. He said he had been amazed by the things he had read in the American media and by the comments made by some of the senators. The Shah ended his complaints by saying he was seriously considering foregoing the idea of AWACS and instead buying a similar plane produced by the British called the Nimrod. Eventually, after the Shah agreed with the administration's request for special security arrangements for AWACS in Iran, the United States agreed to the controversial sale. Yet, before they could be delivered, the revolution came. As the domestic situation deteriorated in Iran, the United States worried about the safety of its highly secret and sophisticated Phoenix missiles, which had been sold to Iran earlier. Lest they fall into Soviet hands, the United States, with the help of Israel, flew all Iranian Air Force planes armed with Phoenix missiles out of the country for safety checks. The aircraft were returned only after the missiles had been dismounted from the planes. Aside from the modern weapon technologies, the question of Iran's nuclear program was also a subject of considerable tension between the Shah and the United States. Iran's nuclear program had begun with a small reactor given by the United States to Tehran University in 1959. It was part of the American Atoms for Peace program announced by President Eisenhower in December 1953. With Iran's increased oil revenues and with the Shah's new vision of Iran as the hegemonic force in the region, even reaching as far as Africa, where the Shah was spending millions of dollars helping King Hassan of Morocco, and where Britain was keen to persuade the Shah to use his oil power on South Africa to convince it to become more democratic, a nuclear program became for him the symbol of progress and power. He summoned Akbar Etemad, a trained nuclear physicist, to the court in 1973, told him of his desire to launch a nuclear program, and asked Etemad to develop a master plan. 2 weeks later, the Shah met with Etemad again. Prime Minister Hoveyda was also present. The Shah quickly read the 13-page draft document Etemad had prepared, went over it a second time, and then turned to the Prime Minister and ordered him to fund what turned out to be one of the most expensive projects undertaken by the regime. There was no prior discussion in the Majlis, where the constitutional power of the purse lay, or in any other governmental body or council. Like every major policy decision in those days, it was a one-man act. Thus was launched Iran's nuclear program. Plans called for a full-fledged nuclear power industry, with the capacity to produce 23,000 megawatts of electricity. By 1977, the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, AEOI, had more than 1,500 employees, who were on the order of the Shah allowed to become the highest paid government employees. The Shah had arranged for the training of Iranian nuclear experts around the world, including a $20 million endowment at MIT, had engaged in an intensive search for uranium mines in Iran and around the world, and had launched several nuclear research centers around the country. The AEOI was in those days one of the most heavily funded programs in the country. One of the firms working with AEOI at the time was called URIRAN. Uriran. It was headed by Reza Niazband, a career technocrat. Uriran's job was to prospect for uranium and to sign contracts with foreign aerial survey firms for a complete radiometric survey of Iran. It was rumored that Uriran was also working with companies in South Africa and Israel on nuclear-related activities. In 1976, $171.7 million was set aside for additional purchase of uranium, while AEOI's budget for the year was $1.3 billion. While Germany and France showed immediate eagerness to sell Iran its desired reactors, the United States was initially reluctant to sell any, without conditions limiting the Shah's freedom of action. The German company Kraftwerk signed the first agreement to build the now famous Bushehr reactor with an initial completion date of 1981 and an estimated cost of $3 billion. As Bushehr was located in a dangerous zone that was prone to frequent and strong seismic activity, extra funds were set aside to protect the site against the dangers of an earthquake. It was said at the time that the German government was so eager to find a foothold in the Iranian market that it guaranteed the investment of Kraftwerk against any loss. The American companies, on the other hand, were barred from these contracts until the federal government's concerns about the Shah's intentions were mitigated. The Shah was adamant that Iran should enjoy its full rights within the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, an agreement Iran had immediately signed upon its formulation, and that called for non-nuclear states to forfeit the search for a nuclear bomb in return for easy access to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But Iran not only insisted on the right to have the full fuel cycle, it also was interested in processing plutonium, a faster way to a nuclear bomb than enriched uranium. Concerns were further aroused shortly after the February 1974 Franco-Iranian Agreement on Nuclear Cooperation, when the Shah told Le Monde that one day, sooner than is believed, Iran would be in a position of a nuclear bomb. The Shah's surprising comment was at least partially in response to the 1974 Indian test of a nuclear weapon. Realizing the repercussions of his comment, the Shah ordered the Iranian embassy in France to issue a statement declaring that stories about the Shah's plan to develop a bomb are totally invented and without any basis whatsoever. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran, too, after talking with the Shah, reassured the American government that he is certainly not yet thinking about leaving NPT or joining the nuclear club. The Shah told Ambassador Helms that he believed this nuclear armaments race is ridiculous. What would one do with them? But even as he was trying to reassure the American government about his intentions, the Shah did indicate that should any country in the region develop the nuclear bomb, then perhaps the national interest of any country at all would demand that it would do the same. The embassy ended its report by indicating that it believed the Shah's statements denying any plans to develop a bomb to accurately reflect Shah's current intentions. Asadullah Alam, the Shah's court minister, claimed more than once in his daily journals that in his view the Shah wanted the bomb, but found it expedient to adamantly deny any intent at the moment. The United States was particularly worried that the annual plutonium production from the planned 23,000 MW Iranian nuclear power program will be equivalent to 600 to 700 warheads. Nonetheless, by June 1974, the United States was finally willing to sell Iran nuclear reactors, but only after incorporating special bilateral controls in addition to the usual international safeguards. These safeguards were, in the mind of U.S. officials, necessary not just because of its concerns about the Shah's intentions, but because in the situation of instability, domestic dissidents or foreign terrorists might easily be able to seize any special nuclear materials stored in Iran for use in a bomb. While the Shah was willing to consider some of these safeguards, he was insistent that Iran could not be treated differently from countries in which America had previously signed power reactor agreements. By then, Iran had already signed letters of intent with German and French companies for a total of 4 nuclear power plants, and the Shah had signaled his plan to procure 8 more from the United States. The State Department not only favored the sale of these reactors, but even encouraged the Bechtel Corporation to solicit the Shah's investment on the order of $300 million in a private uranium enrichment facility to be built in the United States. These proposals were all predicated on the Shah's willingness to accept more rigorous controls over plutonium than the United States had heretofore included in our other agreements. Although eager to offer assurances to the United States, the Shah flatly rejected the idea of affording the Americans a veto on reprocessing of U.S. supplied fuel. Both the Ford and Carter administrations were under a complicated array of pressures and opportunities regarding Iran's nuclear program. Some in Congress were increasingly worried about the Shah's military expenditures and ambitions, and thus averse to the idea of giving him easy access to nuclear technology. But American companies were keen on getting a share of Iran's increasingly large market for such technology. Finally, both administrations knew that negotiations with the Shah on the nuclear issue could prove to be extremely important to America's relations with Iran. The Shah, the U.S. administrations knew, saw these negotiations as a fundamental test to whether Iran will continue to have a special relationship with the United States. At the same time, the United States was convinced that the Shah might be tempted to acquire a nuclear bomb under certain circumstances, amongst them dismemberment of the Pakistani buffer state, a quest to be recognized as the fifth great power, and Iranian desire for political military hegemony within the Persian Gulf. As negotiations on these issues lingered and seemed to have reached an impasse, and the Shah held firm to his rejection of the U.S. veto right, the Department of Defense recommended that the United States reconsider its hard-line approach and accept the Shah's demands. American defense officials were worried that the Shah's unhappiness over the issue carried the threat of poisoning other aspects of U.S.-Iran relations. The fact that France and Germany were more than happy to sell to the Shah what the United States was withholding, and the fact that the Shah, through Etemman, had made clear gestures of possible cooperation with India on Iran's nuclear program, made the case for a U.S. reconsideration of its position more urgent. President Ford and later President Carter agreed to accommodate the Shah, but still only to the extent that U.S. interests in non-proliferation were met. Only after the Shah indicated his willingness to pursue bilateral safeguard agreements, signaled that he was no longer pursuing a reprocessing plant in Iran, was the Carter administration willing to allow American companies to sell reactors to Iran. But by then, the first hints of internal political trouble had already appeared on the horizon. Within months of this crucial agreement, the Shah was too preoccupied with the evolving domestic crisis to pay much attention to the nuclear negotiations. No sooner had Ayatollah Khomeini come to power than he ordered all work on Iran's nuclear program stopped, criticizing the Shah for ever pursuing such a program. Within a few years, Khomeini changed his mind, but by then the West was much more distrustful of Iran's intentions. The Shah's crucial decade from 1965 to 1975 was also critical for the regime's cultural politics. Iran, in this period, was a discordant combination of cultural freedoms and political despotism, of increasing censorship against the opposition but increasing freedoms for everyone else. It is far from hyperbole to claim that during the 60s and 70s, Iran was one of the most liberal societies in the Muslim world in terms of cultural and religious tolerance, and in the state's aversion to interfere in the private lives of its citizens, so long as they did not politically oppose the Shah. Indications of this tolerance were many, from the quality of life of Iran's Baha'is and Jews to the artistic innovations and aesthetic avant-gardism of the Shiraz Art Festival. The famous Italian filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini traveled to Iran often and shot parts of his controversial Decameron, an erotic romp about the sexual shenanigans in medieval monasteries in Isfahan. He was not alone in making these trips. Some of the world's foremost artists and playwrights, from Andrei Grotowski to Peter Brooks, converged on Shiraz to perform or on Tehran to look for funding for films. By the early 1970s, Princess Ashraf and her husband, Mehdi Bushedri, had become interested in producing films. Much to the consternation of the Shiite clergy in this period, the Baha'is enjoyed freedom and virtual equality with their citizens. The same was true about Iranian Jews, some 100,000 of them who had lived in Iran for over 3,000 years. In the words of David Menasheri, it was the Jews' golden age, wherein they enjoyed equality with Muslims, and in terms of their per capita incomes, they might have been the richest Jewish community in the world. Some of Iran's most innovative and successful industrialists, engineers, architects, and artists were either Jewish or Baha'i. The Arj family, dominant in the production of home appliances in Iran, the Sabet family, who brought television and Pepsi to the country, and finally, Habib El-Ghanian, who introduced the nation to the magic of plastic, were all members of the Baha'i and Jewish faiths. The Shah's private physician, Dr. Ayadi, was an active member of the Baha'i faith and was instrumental in facilitating Baha'i security and prosperity in Iran. The Shah had a surprisingly blithe attitude towards the sexual life of those around him. Though he occasionally received reports from Savak about the private lives of the private lives of courtiers, a mistress here, a menage a trois there, and an openly homosexual lifestyle in a third. He was especially, for a leader of Muslim society, remarkably tolerant, even indifferent to the erotic and other private activities of those around him. It was, for example, a sign of his respect for the private lives of his sisters that he never made an issue of his older sister Sham's decision to become a Catholic, nor did he publicly take issue with the storied private life of his twin sister Ashraf, though more than once he commented on and chided her behavior in private, particularly to court minister Alam. And though he refused her entreaty to have the Iranian government underwrite her rather quixotic dream of either herself or one of her protégés becoming the Secretary General of the UN, he made no effort to interfere in her private life. His reticence in pressuring his sisters on these private issues was a sign of both his timidity and his liberal disposition. His aversion to confronting them about their brazen economic activities was a further indication of his timidity, as well as of the arrogance of his power. Power is most insolent when it is most insular. It was a measure of the Shah's isolation that he ignored one of the most telling warnings about the effects of the regime's economic and social policy made by Qasim Lajavardi, a senator and a scion of one of Iran's most successful industrial conglomerates. In a fascinating speech on the floor of the Senate, he offered a de facto manifesto for Iran's nascent industrialist class. In spite of its dire warnings, no one in the government, from the Shah and the court to the cabinet and Savak, deigned to ask Lajavardi to further clarify his position. Lajavardi began his remarks by pointing out the startling fact that 103 of the 104 government-run companies were losing money. The only one that showed any profit was the oil company. He also talked of the dangers of price control, knowing well the Shah's proclivity to use force to control prices, going so far as deputizing an army of students to identify and, if necessary, arrest businessmen accused of price gouging. The policy angered not just modern industrialists like Lajavardi, but also members of the bizarre, long a bastion of support for the moderate opposition and for the clergy. Nowhere in the world, Lajavardi said, had the effort to forcefully control prices led to success. He went on to also criticize the government policy of arbitrarily deciding workers' wages. Wages, he said, must correlate with productivity and cannot, as was the case in Iran, be treated as a political bonus. Industrialists will invest, he said pointedly, only if they are allowed to make a fair profit. By then, a massive flight of capital from Iran had already started, a flight that would be redoubled when the political situation deteriorated. In spite of the desperate nature of his complaints, there was a common theme to him. Capitalism needs security, rule of law, and the force of the market to develop, and it cannot grow if it is held hostage to the vagaries of a single person, even if he is a sagacious leader like the Shah. In Lajavardi's cautious criticisms lay the essence of the contradiction that threatened the Shah's modernizing authoritarianism. The more he won his battles with oil companies and increased Iran's revenue, the more these petrodollars helped create and train a larger and larger technocratic middle class. The more he promised the people standards of living higher than those of Japan or Germany, the more these impressive accomplishments convinced him of his global importance. The more he inadvertently prepared the conditions of his own downfall, the middle classes he helped create wanted democracy, and the hubris of his increasing authoritarianism made them increasingly uneasy. The statistical portrait of the Shah's accomplishment was indeed impressive. In 1941, there were only 351 high schools and 8 universities in the country. In 1974, on the eve of the Shah's creation of the one-party system, there were 2,314 high schools and 148 universities. In 1941, there were only 482 large industrial institutions in Iran, whereas in 1974 the number had increased to 5,651. The annual growth of industry went from 5% per year in 1962 to 20% in 1974. The share of the industrial production in the gross national product increased from 11.7% to about 17%, while employment in the private sector went from 1.3 million workers to 1962 to more than 2 million in 1974. Even more impressive changes had been made in the number of women in schools. While the percentage of illiteracy amongst women was in 1972 still higher than amongst men, between 1961 and 1972 the number of female students at different educational levels increased 13% for primary schools, 30% for high schools, 88% for technical schools, and 65% for institutions of higher education. Yet in spite of these accomplishments, even someone like Lajavardi was by 1975 disgruntled. The ultimate measure of a wise ruler, Edmund Burke argued, after observing revolutions in France and England, is not just the ability to change society, but also the ability and disposition to preserve those changes. Everything else, he said, is vulgar in conception and perilous in execution. There is no doubt that from 1965 to 1975 the Shah guided Iran through remarkable changes. Some of them even survived the fall of his regime. Iranian women refused to give up their rights and return to their sacred motherly duties just because Khomeini and his cohorts seized power. It is equally true that the totality of those changes, their tempo and texture, as well as the Shah's style and substance of leadership, ultimately begot the Islamic Revolution of 1979. If, in that decisive decade, the celebration of 2,500 years of monarchy was the most lavish and controversial event organized by the Shah, then what happened during the Shah's speech at the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargad? Billed as the official launch of the ceremonies, was a potent metaphor of what lay ahead. As the Shah began to speak, telling Cyrus that he could repose in peace, for we are awake, his unusually tremulous voice proved no match for the sandstorm and heavy winds that were suddenly unleashed. If the speech at the Cyrus tomb became the subject of much ridicule, one of the Shah's most enduring legacies is the Shayat monument, built to commemorate the 2,500 celebrations, a monument that powerfully captured his aborted vision for Iran. End of chapter 16.